Throughout history, man has feared many mythical monsters. The Kraken, the Dragon, the Mothman, and Bigfoot. But there is one monster that outrivals them all. A monster of modernity. A monster found only in the darkness. A monster who is said to lurk deep in the hearts of every man. A monster known as the Coomer. The Coomer can often be found in his natural habitat, a dark humid room with mouldy walls and a mysteriously stained carpet. A box of opened tissues can also usually be found next to a well-used crusty chair and a can of Monster Energy Extra Strength. The Coomer has an unusual physiology, with one arm being much more muscular than the other. His head can often be identified by its immense baldness. His eyes give away no emotion, dead and beady, and his mouth is always smiling, though more out of madness than happiness. However, dear viewer, as shocking as it may sound, all Coomers were once normal men. So what exactly turns a man into a Coomer? Well... Alright pal, listen up, you've got two choices. You can either look at me, your good friend Alex Hexagon, you know me, I want to teach you something you need to know, or alternatively, you can look at the dancing lady over there, and that's the road to hell, my friend. Which one is it? You want to look at me? I'm the good guy, I want to teach you something, I'm your friend, hello? Or do you want to look at the lady? Which one is it? Take your pick, take your pick. You can only look at one at the same time. We can only look at one at the same time. Take your pick, which one is it? Her? Me? Her or me? Pick one, her or me. Hey, you looking at me? Look at me. Look at me, don't you dare look at her. Don't you dare look at her. You're better than that. You're better than that, right? Look at me, not her. Look at me. Look at me. Are you looking at me? Are you looking at me? Look at me! Dear viewer, I don't know when you're watching this. It could be January, May, September, or the period when time folds in on itself during the end times. I don't know. But at the time of recording, it is currently November. Or, as some people have taken to call it, No Nut November. Many years ago when I first heard of No Nut November, I thought it was a month where people protested the eating of nuts to stand in solidarity with people who had nut allergies. Needless to say, when people asked me if I was participating, only for me to turn around and say, "No, I love eating nuts," I got some very unusual looks. As it turned out, No Nut November had nothing to do with our salty snack friends, but rather a communal event that celebrates chastity and restraint against the horrors of adult material. With the idea being that you have to go an entire month without, shall we say, doing your business. As someone who never watches such haram filth, I have genuinely been baffled at some of the rhetoric surrounding this event that I have seen thus far. As everywhere I look, I am met with tales from people who, even after just 24 hours of chastity, are seemingly struggling to keep it together. Even in the internet's largest mental asylum, the House Hexagon Discord server, No Nut November has quickly become one of the most popular topics of discussion, with many such similar tales of frustration, much to my surprise. And so, out of curiosity, I did a poll where I asked you all, how often do you watch adult material? 24% of you said never, 2% of you said at least once a year, 17% of you said at least once a month, 39% of you said at least once a week, and an absolutely shocking 17% of you said at least once every day. Every day? Where'd you find the time? I have to be honest, whenever I do a poll, I'm often not too surprised by the answers, but this one genuinely baffled me. I had known that the consumption of adult material, particularly amongst young men, was quite a common phenomenon in the post-internet era, but not this common. 17%? I would classify someone as a Coomer, meaning a man who's addicted to watching adult material, as someone who does so at least once a week. And if we crunch the numbers from this poll, that means that 56% of respondents meet such a classification. That's 5 out of every 10 men. But this is even worse when you consider that the vast majority of people who will come across my productions, and thus answered said poll, also tend to be religious, who are often innately swayed away from such behaviour via their faith. One can only imagine how much higher this statistic is amongst the godless, who don't have such a divine motivator to dissuade them. I mean, Christ, the real number could even be as high as 7 or even 8 out of 10. Which, needless to say, paints a really depressing picture for men.
Excuse me? Yeah, hi. Don't you think you're being a little, judgmental? I mean, it's just a bit of fun, you know? It's harmless, and well, I think you should just let people enjoy things.
How about no? Because the truth is that watching adult material is not harmless. On the contrary, it is genuinely one of the worst things you can do to yourself as a man. As much like how excessive smoking can slowly destroy your body, excessive consumption of adult material can slowly destroy your mind. And it isn't talked about anywhere near enough. Thus, gentlemen, throughout this production, I'm going to explain to you 3 things. Why only men specifically seem to get addicted to adult material, what watching such filth actually does to your brain, and perhaps most importantly of all, what should be done about it. So without further ado, let's begin. Number 1. Why do only men specifically seem to get addicted to adult material? Now, this originally sounds quite stupid, but it's actually quite an interesting question. Whenever you read into tales of people who have such an addiction and thus are struggling to control themselves in events such as No Nut November, they are, 99% of the time, men. But why, exactly? I mean, after all, it's not like women don't feel similar feelings of attraction. So why aren't there endless stories of women coomers who just can't help themselves seeing buff man muscles like mine? Well, while it is true that both men and women have such feelings, it tends to manifest very differently for each. Men tend to prefer visual stimuli, and thus can go from having zero interest to maximum interest in seconds given the right visual motivation, with almost no emotional investment nor build-up required. And this can be proven very easily. For example, if I open up the good old Microsoft Paint and draw the letter C, then mirror that C backwards, then surround them both with parallel brackets, then despite the fact that I've just drawn a bunch of seemingly abstract symbols, a deep-seated primal monkey brain starts to kick in for men, even over a visual representation that is this vague, innocent, and mundane. Women, on the other hand, will find this to be absolutely unbelievable, as they, unlike men, do not necessarily sway towards visual stimuli, but emotional stimuli. As for women, the experience of lust is more than just a visual or even physical transaction, but one of a deeper emotional desire. It's not a coincidence that the most popular mature book of the modern era, 50 Shades of Grey, was overwhelmingly bought, not by men, but by women. Right, let's see what this is about. When literature student Anastasia Steele interviews successful entrepreneur Christian Grey, she finds him very attractive and deeply intimidating. Unworldly and innocent, Anna is shocked to find she wants this man, and excited when she realises that Christian wants her too. As they embark on a passionate love affair, Anna discovers more about her own desires, as well as the dark secrets Christian keeps hidden away from public view. Do you see what I mean? TLDR, men prefer the action, women prefer the plot. So it's not so much that only men are affected by adult material, but that such material of a visual style is much more appreciated by men, whereas women prefer emotional stimuli. But whereas emotional stimuli often requires some creativity via imagination, visual stimuli is nothing more than brain-dead unhealthy consumption of an ever-emboldening nature, which just so happens to be far more damaging. Which brings us on nicely to number 2. What does watching adult material actually do to your brain? Well, how do I put this bluntly? It destroys it. It's almost as if men have two different modes. Their surface persona, him as he presents himself to the world, and their inner animal, the person he becomes when lustful. Whereas for women, the two modes are usually but one and the same, and an inseparable experience as such. This is often why, psychologically, men can go from having absolute fascination with a woman to borderline zero care at all, almost instantly, after a lustful experience. Much to the shock of said woman, as it wasn't really him that they were interacting with, but the inner animal. Which, by the way, is just one of a million reasons why recreational intercourse is a terrible thing, but besides the point. Sometimes, with men, the surface persona and the inner animal can likewise be in sync, as, by the way, they should be. But this becomes ever increasingly unlikely should said men start to excessively consume adult material, as for such men, their inner animal can start to feel as if it is at war with their surface persona, due to becoming increasingly strange. You see, most men, when they start watching adult material, will start by seeking relatively innocent contents. Things like women in bikinis and that kind of thing. But much like how when one eats too much, the size of your stomach increases and thus you require more food in order to feel sated, what quickly starts to happen is that men who watch an artificially excessive amount of adult material fatigue their subconscious lust, and in response demand more, shall we say, hardcore contents. And this phenomenon, over an extended period of many weeks, months and years, can manifest one's mind into becoming absolutely perverted. In my view, there are 3 levels of perversion, with each one getting worse than the last. First, mild perversion, whereby the subject starts to attain desires that are ultimately harmless, but still quite bizarre, such as being fascinated by one particular part of the body, or a certain type of body. The recent rise of the tomboy aesthetic, whereby men claim that they desire a woman who is taller and more muscular than them, usually while having stereotypically male interests to match, is an incredibly common side effect of overexposure to adult material. Good luck trying to tell them that though, as the amount of debates I've had on radio with men about this topic is absolutely astronomical, and they're all in denial. No, Alex, you don't get it! It's totally normal to want to have a 7'4" wife who looks like She-Hulk. Yes, I might have fried my brain by watching adult material 7 days a week, but it's totally unrelated, man! Trust me! Okay, Coomer. The second type is mid-perversion, whereby the subject can start to crave much more disturbing desires, such as wanting to treat others badly, or to have others treat them badly. The rise of the simp phenomenon, whereby men like to essentially humiliate themselves before, usually women, but sometimes even other men, is a clear example of this in action. And speaking of simps, let me tell you a story. I have a friend of mine that I've known for almost 20 years now, and he is, to put it bluntly, an absolute psychopath. He wouldn't mind me saying that either. In fact, he'd probably take it as a compliment. But he is, by his own admission, notorious for having low empathy for other people, excluding those closest to him. One day, he comes to me and says that he's thought of a genius money-making technique. The idea was that he was going to pretend to be a woman on Steam, a video games digital distribution store, and convince men of a simpish nature to buy him games that he wanted, as well as getting them to send over money to him in general. I responded that it was a foolish idea because there's no way that it would actually work. How wrong I was. 1 week later, and he had managed to gather a simp army like none I'd ever seen before. And the seemingly endless amounts of games that he was gifted as a result was truly unbelievable. And that's not even including the heaps of virtual items. He was even sent over $200 worth of Amazon gift cards, so much so that he even had enough money to buy a new professional microphone for our radio show. He had, obviously, never spoken to these men directly, nor given them anything in return. But just the mere idea that he was someone they could simp over was more than enough for them. And on that note, if anyone wants to give me all of their money, you're more than welcome to do so. Of course, all of the men who sent such goods apparently had one thing in common. They were all massively addicted to watching adult material. Shocking! A prime example of the inner animal becoming corrupted, only to go on to conquer the surface persona, mistranslating love as hate and starting to make bad decisions as such. Which brings us on to the third and most serious type of perversion, major perversion, whereby, in exceptionally disturbing cases, the subject will even start to pivot over to illegal acts, such as, well, things that are so evil that I don't want to pollute your mind by even uttering them. However, do you know that type of bloke who never leaves his mum's basement, has 3 monitors, owns a 16TB hard drive, and for some reason, despite being a grown man, always seems to make his profile picture a young anime girl? Well, let's just say that if I was Prime Minister, I'd put this kind of bloke on a watch list. And with good reason. Overall, what stage of perversion an individual reaches ultimately depends on how much their subconscious lust has been artificially warped by the consumption of adult material, and also by a myriad of factors beyond their control, such as psychological genetic predispositions. Either way, however, it should be common knowledge that when one watches adult material, you are essentially signing a form saying that you agree to slowly have your mind warped into almost certainly becoming perverted, and potentially even becoming a monster. In fact, the consumption of adult material is known to be so psychologically damaging that there has even been accusations of certain governments intentionally pushing explicit content onto their rival nations in order to destabilize their populations. For example, TikTok is owned by a Chinese company, and as the Chinese Communist Party essentially has a monopoly of power over all companies in its nation, you could realistically make the argument that TikTok is a Chinese government-run application. Yet whereas the Chinese version of the app is heavily controlled and restricted, resulting in very blissful content, on the Western version of the app, all sorts of decadence is constantly pushed via its algorithms, usually to its very young user base. Granted, it's hard to say if this is intentional, as after all, pretty much everything in China is much more controlled. Which, by the way, is a good thing. But the question still stands. If they can do such a good job at keeping the Chinese version of the app squeaky clean, then why do they fail so much at doing the same on the Western version? Could it be that similar to how the British historically pushed the addictive and crippling drug of opium in China in order to weaken its population from within while profiteering from such atrocities, that the Chinese government is now intentionally peddling this form of digital opium onto us? There is, after all, no more a devious way to destroy a nation than to corrupt its own people. Only time will tell, I suppose, but either way. When something is so bad that it can even be classified as a weapon of psychological warfare, one should really start to question if it's wise to consume it. Something that really annoys me about the modern decadent West is this permeating attitude that men watching adult material is just normal. But it's not normal. On the contrary, the availability of such poison in both quantity and quality is a relatively recent phenomenon, only really being prominent ever since the rise of the internet in the late 1990s. We've only seen the effects of such filth on a grand scale on just a single generation, and the consequences for them have been beyond disturbing. This nonsense notion that it's just something everyone does and that it's totally normal needs to be completely and utterly obliterated from status quo thinking. I mean, some people become so helpless that they can't even stop watching it at work.
Morning, Callum. Hope you're feeling better. Can see you're logged in via remote access. Your screen here is visible, and we can all see you watching porn in between enquiries. If you go to the top of the screen, there's a menu bar. One of the icons will have a black screen option. If you click on this, it'll blank out your office machine so you can continue in private. Thanks, Gary.
I mean, really? Come on, Callum. Well, actually, no, don't come on, Callum. Come off, Callum. Perversion happens exactly because the mind wasn't designed to be exposed to such imagery so effortlessly and in such large doses, and in response, malfunctions, breaking men's minds into confusion and slowly turning them into animals.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure there was a certain book from 1,400 years ago that kind of talked about all this.
And relate to them the story of him to whom we delivered our signs, but he detached himself from them. So Satan went after him, and he became one of the perverts. Had we willed, we could have elevated him through them, but he clung to the ground and followed his desires. They have hearts with which they do not understand. They have eyes with which they do not see. They have ears with which they do not hear. These are like cattle. In fact, they are further astray. These are the heedless. I mean, really, how can you look at yourself in the mirror and have any pride in yourself if you can't even control your own body? When we are younger, we can't even use a toilet properly, constantly peeing and pooping ourselves, because, at the time at least, we are so dumb that we can't even comprehend embarrassment. But like Adam and Eve after eating the fruit in the Garden of Eden, as we get older, we slowly learn right from wrong, and henceforth try to act like a civilized human being as such. But a man who's addicted to watching filth, such as adult material, in a way, still can't control his own body 20, 30, 40 years later, albeit in a different way. He is, nevertheless, however, a mere slave to his instincts, just like an animal. And imagine this, just for a moment, from the woman's perspective. You're a woman who's in a relationship with a man who has an addiction to watching filth. To your face, he says he loves you, but you know deep down that as soon as you turn your back, he'll be fantasizing about other women, because he can't control himself. How would that make you feel? Oh, and by the way, regardless of the level of perversion, 3 more universal side effects of watching adult material are 1. Being much more likely to cheat, due to getting cosmetically bored much easier. 2. Being weirdly obsessed with female celebrities, for obvious reasons. And 3. Not being able to perform properly, because they've trained their mind to be an observer rather than a participator.
Sign me up!
For all that one complains about the downfall of femininity in the modern era, and the systematic abandonment of societal requirements such as motherhood and marriage, I have to play devil's advocate for a moment and say, why the hell would women want to sign up to dedicating their lives to a modern man when most can't even control their own bodily functions? If one is going to complain about the average lower quality of woman, then one too has to come to terms with the fact that men likewise are of a lower quality in tandem. And a large part of that is the mass acceptance of the consumption of adult material. Which brings us on finally to number 3. What should be done about it? Simple. It's time to stop. I've seen some people say, yeah, I'll do No Nut November, but on December 1st, I'm gonna have the biggest you-know-what ever. But if that's how you think, then you've completely missed the point. As the purpose of No Nut November isn't to just have some sort of temporary challenge, but to mentally wean you away from such filth permanently. So if you just go back to being a balding coomer right after the fact, you might as well not bother in the first place. To any men who feel as if there's no way back from the evils of excessive consumption of adult material, fearing that their once pure brain has been forever fried, know that redemption is always available. I've studied the stories of many men who have suffered with such an addiction, and those who came through, no pun intended, all tell me of a similar fate. The longer that one abstains from such filth, the less one will crave it, and its negative ailments will slowly start to disappear. But that journey has to start somewhere. The facts are that if you are a man of righteous conduct, you will never be the man you want to be, the husband you want to be, the father you want to be, unless you shed this barbaric animalism once and for all. And the sooner you start, the easier that it will be. But here's a question for you. How did we, as a society, even get to this point? I knew a woman who lived in a country known as the United Arab Emirates, a very wealthy nation in the Middle East. And I remember her telling me something quite interesting. Apparently, if one tried to access a dirty website over there, their government had instructed, by law no less, all of their internet service providers to block access to it. This is, of course, because the UAE is a nation that has an Islamic foundation. And as those Quran quotes I spoke of earlier imply, humans acting like animals is heavily frowned upon in Islam. Thus, the underlying logic behind such blockages were that they didn't want their young men to become corrupted by such contents. Similar to, as mentioned earlier, how China also operates. Now realistically, trying to censor adult material on the internet is like trying to put out a fire in hell. Good luck. But isn't it interesting how the leaders of other nations, specifically those we in the West are often quick to criticise, at least try to protect their men? Meanwhile, our own Western leaders don't seem to give a flying flamingo. But why? I mean, you'd think, considering the unbelievable list of negative effects that such a poison can have on a man, especially with just how young and unsupervised many people are when they start using the internet these days, that this would be a top priority and some sort of national emergency. So why isn't it? And the answer to that is actually quite simple. Because Western governments don't care about their men. I've said it once, I'll say it again, and I won't stop saying it until everyone has it drilled into them. Ever since the 1960s with the Cultural Revolution and the 1980s with economic globalization, the Western world has been under a ruling ideology known as neoliberalism. That being social progressivism and economic conservatism. And though such a process has brought some good things, ultimately, all of that which once made the Western world great, collectivism, intellectualism, patriotism, religion and family, have also since been all but destroyed. And in its place is one value, and one value only: the endless pursuit of money. Of course our governments don't care if there's a huge swath of men who are becoming mentally ill from such filth. As under neoliberalism, all that matters is gross domestic product, the stock market, and free trade. Adult material is, after all, a very lucrative business. And in a land where only money matters, the very concept of filing legislation in order to protect people over generating such finances is simply an unbelievable ask. We in the West are quick to criticise other parts of the world, but riddle me this. The Muslims of the Middle East have their faith in Allah. The people of China have their national pride. But what do we in the West have that unites us as a collective? Nothing. As in this newfound neoliberal West, you are but an individual, and you are never meant to have any concerns except consuming products. And so I say to the men in the Western world watching this, that they should never forget that their governments, such as those in the hellscapes of Washington DC, London and Paris, chose to prioritise profits over their health. Though I suppose that shouldn't be too much of a surprise. As over here in the UK, a Conservative Party Member of Parliament was recently caught red-handed watching such filth himself in the Parliament. And I thought Callum was bad. What does it say when I, a young man of borderline zero notoriety, ever so passionately craft these productions to my small audience completely for free? Meanwhile, the British public are forced to pay tens of thousands of pounds per year to our representatives, who again are meant to be the best of us, only for them to behave like this. It says that our nation has become a nation of perverts, by perverts, for perverts, and a reformation is beyond required. And reform it shall. Throughout history, there has been many societies that have turned a blind eye to decadence, as the modern West today does. But their fate is always one and the same: reformation. And ours shall be no different. Because mark my words, much like how it's always darkest before dawn, a grand overcorrection is on the way when it comes to issues such as this. Not today, not tomorrow, but sometime in the future. And during such times, Western nations will once again receive healthy institutions and upstanding governments in tandem that actually protect the welfare of their people as deserved. This nonsensical idea that freedom, or freedom as it should be known, is the primary value of Western society needs to be flushed down the toilet right where it belongs. as the primary value of Western society should be, just as it always was, morality. To do what is right, just and pure for the people at large, money and profits be damned. But alas, we in the West have become a spiritually sick people, and thus bathe in ignorance as such. So protect your brothers, protect your sons, and even protect yourselves if truly necessary. For all the men who feel frustrated, ashamed, or even saddened by their woes in this regard, know that though personal responsibility does ultimately lie with you to make such a change, let it be known that you should not have had to deal with such a problem in the first place. Fortunately, however, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. As with every day that passes, the damage that adult material causes is only becoming more well known, as proven by the very existence of events such as No Nut November. And the neoliberal ideology that enables such filth to permeate without remorse is likewise only guaranteed to follow suit. Through a combined tactic of promoting a culture of self-restraint on an individual level, as well as promoting a culture of morality on a collective level, it is only a matter of time until the next generations won't have to deal with such an evil burden as ours did. Every man has a choice to make. Do you want to be a man or an animal? If you want to be an animal, then by all means, take the easy route and keep acting on your instincts, continuing to rot your brain with such filth, and see where it gets you. But on the other hand, if you want to be a man, then prepare for some painful demands of willpower in the short term. But in the long term, know that in the end, that you will certainly be of the winners. Gentlemen, it's time. Time for No Nut Never. Or just use your imagination if you really have to. Jesus Christ. Alright folks, I hope you enjoyed that, and I'm really interested to see people's comments on this one, because I know for a fact that there'll be a large group of people out there who will say that I'm overreacting and that adult material is not as much of a scourge on society as I think it is. But no, it is. It absolutely is. This is a massive problem that hardly anyone's talking about. The normalization of filth, watching filth, is peak decadence, to put it bluntly, and it absolutely ruins people's lives. I've never had a problem with this myself, but I've known many, many, many people who have, and you just see these men who are great transform into these absolute monsters. And I think it's an absolute tragedy. It needs to be spoken about more. This is a problem. And so, yeah, I'm curious to hear. And I will be reading some of your comments out on the Patreon exclusive podcast. What are you waiting for, folks? Get to patreon.com/AlexHexagon and subscribe. You don't want to miss out on these podcasts. What are you, crazy? Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that, and I'll see you next time.